Since its construction in the 1920s, the Empire State Building has become a historic landmark and a symbol of American innovation. But who owns this icon? The answer is more complicated than you might think. These are the many owners of the Empire State Building. Real estate is full of rivalries and races to be the biggest and the best, and that's exactly how the Empire State Building got its start. Its very first owner was a group of investors led by its builder, J Raskob. Raskob got rich working for DuPont and General Motors in the 19-teens, and during the skyscraper boom of the 1920s, got into the race to the sky against the builders at 40 Wall Street and the Chrysler Building to put up the tallest skyscraper in the world. In 1931, Raskob won that race. The Empire State Building topped out at 1,454 feet tall, including its antenna, which at the time was intended to be a docking station for airships. But by then, the boom of the 20s was over, and the country was deep into the Great Depression. Only 23% of the building's office space was leased in the first year. The 86th floor observation deck was an instant hit, but many New Yorkers mocked it as the empty State Building. Tenants slowly trickled in, and with help from the observatory and broadcasting networks who leased space at the top for their antennas, the building became profitable in the early 50s. But Raskob died in 1950, and his estate put the building on the market. It sold in 1951 for $51 million, a record-breaking deal. The new owners were a group of Detroit real estate investors, including Roger L. Stevens and Colonel Henry J. Crown. In 1954, Crown bought out the other partners and became the sole owner of the building. But Crown's reign on 34th Street was short-lived. In 1961, he sold the property for $65 million, another record-breaking price, to real estate investor Lawrence Wien, attorney and developer Harry Helmsley, and Wien's son-in-law and partner, Peter Malkin. Now, Wien had actually invented the concept of real estate syndicates back in the 1930s, which meant he got groups of smaller investors to go in on one big income-producing property, which none of the investors could have bought individually. So in 61, when they went to buy the Empire State, Wien and his partners raised tens of millions through a syndicate called Empire State Building Associates. That meant that now there were really thousands of owners, or at least thousands of people who owned one share of the company that owned the building. And that company subleased the building to another company, which was owned by Wien and Helmsley, allowing them to keep control. Despite the big ticket sale and the renovation campaign that the new owners started, 1961 was a tough year for the world's tallest building. Plans were proposed for twin towers in the financial district, which, at 110 stories, would take the top spot as the world's tallest buildings. And indeed, in 1970, the World Trade Center's North Tower surpassed the Empire State, becoming the tallest building in the world. The 70s and 80s weren't all bad for the Empire State. The building saw its 40 millionth visitor in 1971, and in 1980 got its own zip code, but trouble was brewing right underneath the owners' noses, specifically in the ground. You see, buildings are expensive. They're expensive to buy, to own, and to maintain, and there are lots of rules about who can buy them and when and how. That leads to some pretty complicated ownership structures. So way back in 1951, when the building was sold to Henry Crown, they actually sold the land under the building to Prudential Insurance. When Crown was selling the building to Wien and Helmsley and Malkin, they actually bought the land from Prudential Insurance for $17 million, then sold both the land and the building back to the insurance company for a total of $46 million, in return for an 114-year lease on the building with a rent of more than $3 million per year. So now you have Prudential owning the land and the building, with Wien and Helmsley and Malkin owning, effectively, the right to lease it up and operate it and profit from it for 114 years, as long as they paid Prudential their rent, which was all perfectly fine until 1991. In 91, Prudential sold its stake to Oliver Grace Jr. Only Oliver Grace Jr. wasn't really the buyer. He was acting as a front for Hideki Yokoi, a Japanese businessman who was actually in prison because a hotel he'd owned and allegedly neglected had burned down in 1982, killing 33 people. And then another notorious real estate figure comes into the picture, Donald J. Trump. In 1994, Trump entered into a partnership with Yokoi. The goal? To take over the building itself. In 95, Trump and Yokoi's daughter sued Empire State Building Associates. Trump called the building a high-rise slum and claimed it was rodent-infested. This started a pretty epic legal battle that would last for 7 years. To make things worse, in 1997, Helmsley died. Wien had died back in 1988, which left just his son-in-law, Peter Malkin, and Malkin's son, Anthony. The Malkins sued Helmsley's widow, Leona, the Queen of Mean Helmsley, and his former law partners at the firm Helmsley Spear to gain full control of the building. This battle would go on for more than 9 years. In 2002, Trump and Yokoi threw in the towel on their takeover attempt. They sold the ground to Empire State Building Associates, which was still controlled by the Malkins, for $57.5 million, still turning a pretty nice profit. And in 2006, the Malkins won another battle against Helmsley Spear, putting the Malkins and their group in full control of the ground and the building. 2 years later, they started on a major renovation project to pull in more corporate tenants. In 2008, the building had another short-lived owner, the New York Daily News. The local paper briefly stole the building using a fake notary stamp and forged documents to illustrate how easy deed fraud was in New York. They returned it to the Malkins Company the following day. In 2012, the Malkins made another big move. They filed plans to form a real estate investment trust, or REIT, called Empire State Realty Trust. A small group of investors from the Building Associates Group did put up a fight, but in 2013, the REIT, with the Empire State at the center of its portfolio, debuted on the New York Stock Exchange. That brings us to today. The building recently turned 90 years old and finished an $165 million renovation in 2019. The observatories are open, but with ESRT trading daily on the stock exchange, you could own a tiny share of the building yourself for less than the price of a visit to the 86th floor.